Hey everyone. Today, electrical. Yeah, no, don't run away. Thanks for not running away. So in this video, we're just going to connect the dots. We've got this harness. This is what came out of the 93 Turbo. And we've got this harness, which is what the 2GR needs. Now, this looks scary. Seriously, don't be scared. Most of these wires, you've got this big electrical connector here for the ECU. They go directly to the right plugs they need to go. We're just not going to touch those at all. What this really comes down to is we've got these plugs. This is the chassis integration part. And in the MR2, we've got these that go to the fuse box, and then also this that goes to the connector under the ECU. And lastly, there's a plug that goes in here into the chassis. And just as a reminder, this is from a 93 Turbo, and this is from a 2009 or earlier RAV4. And before we go any further, YouTube doesn't allow me to make a correction to the video, and they punish deleting or making a video private. So check up here. If there's a link, you might want to click it. It's either going to go to a newer corrected video or a few notes about mistakes in this video. And something to note, in the early 90s, auto manufacturers were still very much customizing wiring harnesses. They're all built by hand, so it was worth it to save one wire or two wires on a wiring harness because it was actually saving money on the final build. These days, harnesses are a lot more unified, but that's not entirely what we're dealing with. One of the examples of this is the 3SGTE connector, and above here, you can see the 5SFE connector. As you can see, they're completely different, which also means that the wiring harness that's plugging into it is completely different. So before you go copying this video pin for pin, realize that unless your car is a 1993 Turbo, there's going to be some small differences in your harness. Now, a lot of what I'm saying here still applies. All of the same functions are going to be available on all the MR2s. They all use the same electrical architecture. It's just the location of the pins move a little bit. And while I'm not going to be making videos for the other applications, the documentation that's in the description below will start as only 93 Turbo, but over time I hope to add the other applications. And I believe it's going to come down to 6 different diagrams. You've got the 5SFE and the 3SGTE, and then you've got the 91, 92, and then 93 plus. Now note, 93 plus, the pinout didn't change on the wiring harness, but it did change name. Like for example, in 93, this plug that we need to plug into is called E6. And in 95, because other things in the car changed, it's called E4. Now the pins themselves don't move, but it's still something you got to deal with. It's a little annoying. Just be careful when you're reading the diagrams. And the other variants we need to talk about is the 2GR donor harness. I'm starting with the 2009 and earlier RAV4, not because it's the easiest one to find, because it really isn't, unfortunately, but it's by far the easiest one to wire. And the reason for that is, if you look here, this is the main ECU plug, and then this is all the fuse box connections. On all the other harnesses, there's fuse box connections at this end of the harness, there's some at this end of the harness, and the ECU's on the wrong end of the harness too. So you just end up with something that doesn't properly fit in the engine bay without a whole bunch of wire extensions. And we're trying to keep this as simple as possible. It's certainly doable, but if you're watching this video for pin-by-pin tips, I don't want to complicate it by doing that. As of February 2020, you can get one of these brand new from the dealer for about $750, and you can find them at the junkyards for about $250, $350 or so. They're not just available all over eBay, so you do have to look a little bit. The other really nice thing that it adds is these are the RAV4 plugs, and these are the MR2 plugs. You might not be able to tell right away, but the connectors are actually the same. So on some wires that'll actually fit, we'll just de-pin them right from here and pin them right into here, and we don't even have to add a splice. So yeah, so it really does make things a lot easier. So search for this harness. It's worth the trouble. Now you can see right here, this is the stock wiring diagram. Well, there's about 150 wires on that. We're just not going to use that. As I was saying, most of these wires are already connected. They're on the big ECU connector, and they go right to the correct sensor wire, and we don't need to touch them at all. So keep watching, we're going to simplify this down. So we absolutely know, if our ECU is plugged in here in this main harness connector, and the RAV4 connects these wires, and these wires, obviously the engine has to be able to run. So let's start from there. Let's take pictures of these connectors, let's identify them in the wiring diagram, and find out all the pins that are there, and figure out what their functions are. Let's start that. If we reference the wiring diagrams, we can see that what we have here is the BA1, BA3, BA4, and B29. As a side note, I'm not sure why Toyota always names the connectors that go from the engine harness to the chassis BA or BC. It probably stands for something, but I have no idea what that something is. If you know, please tell me. And we can even eliminate the B29 right away, the small little one, because it's the battery current sensor, and we're not going to be using that. And then let's knock out the pins that don't have a wire in the hole. And now we see we've barely looked at the wiring diagram, and we've knocked down our load to about 30 wires from 150. See, it's getting easier already, and we haven't even done anything. And then, of course, don't forget the second ECU plug. This adds about another 20 wires. So we're down to about 50 wires right now, and there's plenty more to eliminate. But let's start here. Let's figure out what all these pins mean. So let's look up on the wiring diagram, see what they mean, find what their function is, and we're just going to list them in a spreadsheet like this. And you can quickly see there's a bunch of stuff on here that we just don't need. So let's start eliminating from here. First, there's a start signaling that we just don't need. The evap stuff that doesn't really work in the MR2 anyways. The secondary O2 sensors aren't needed in this application. Now keep in mind, just because you're not running the secondary O2 sensors doesn't mean you can't run catalytic converters. The only odd thing you may notice in the remaining list is that I left the D input to the ECU for the automatic transmission range sensor. This puts the ECU in a different throttle mode, so just leaving the ECU permanently in drive makes everything just a little bit better. So that's why if you're using one of my tuned ECUs, the only transmission code that's left that it can throw is the transmission range sensor, is to remind you to hook up the drive to ignition to change the throttle map. I wish I could do it inside the tune, but I haven't figured that out yet. So it's just a reminder to hook up that wire. So now we're down to 33 wires left, and some of them even get just hooked right back to each other. So I've categorized them right here. Comes down to 15 wires needed to make the engine run, and the charging system work, and another 6 to hook up the accelerator pedal. The rest is just to make the gauge cluster and reverse lights work. So then, converting the spreadsheet to a wiring diagram, what you end up with here is this thing here right here, which is effectively a standalone wiring harness for a 2GR. If you're using this to swap it into any car that isn't an MR2, this is a good place to start, and that diagram can be downloaded right from the video description below. And while it's useful for a lot of people, the intent of this video is for people that have even less ability to be able to swap this easily. So let's make it MR2 specific. And of course, in my case, it means 93 turbo specific. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to start with the connectors we've got, and we're going to figure out what they do. We can see that what we have here is EA1, EA3, EB1, and E6 for the ECU. And of course, the alternator charging cable, EA4. Also, it's really convenient. There's no connector name overlapping between these two applications. So we're just going to use the connector names right from the MR2 as well as from the RAV4 together on the same diagram, and there's not going to be any overlap. So through video magic, you don't have to spend 90 minutes looking it up. Here it is. At this point, we just need to throw this information together with the standalone harness and see what we can come up with as a blended harness. But we want to be really careful because sometimes the weirdest things change that you simply wouldn't expect. And the prime example is right here. So here's the MR2 wiring diagram for the fuel pump, and here's the 2GR one. Now you'll notice both of these are 2-speed fuel pumps, but on the MR2 one, it actuates the relay to go low speed, and on the 2GR one, it actuates the relay to go high speed. So the 2-speed pump is really not needed. It just quiets the cabin down a little bit. We're just going to eliminate that function. Of course, if you really hate the noise of that Walbro pump, you can reverse the polarity on that relay and figure it out. But again, we're trying to make this as simple as possible. Simple as possible is just leave the pump in full speed mode all the time. The pump is designed to handle it. We have a few more decisions to make. As we can see, the 2GR has a relay for the oxygen sensor heaters. The MR2 actually doesn't have oxygen sensor heaters. It uses older style oxygen sensors, but in this case it's super convenient. We can actually just use the vent fan relay, which is meant for constant duty anyways. Since the 2GR runs a lot cooler without the turbo in the engine bay, we're going to pull the fan from the engine bay, and we have a relay right there that's already fused to 20 amps, and we're going to use that as an O2 system heater. And from here, I just kept playing connect the dots, just aligning functions that the 2GR wants with what's available on the MR2, doing my best to avoid putting extra circuitry in the middle, and making sure not to overload branch current limits. In the end, this is the diagram I got. There are certainly other valid solutions, but this is optimized to the best of my ability given the system constraints. The other thing you may have noticed on that diagram was the starter circuitry. The starter circuitry on the 2GR is in the chassis wiring, but the starter circuitry on the MR2 is actually in the engine diagram. So in the standalone, that circuitry wasn't there, but on the MR2 specific one, the circuitry is there, and we're effectively just going to pull it right here, right from the MR2 harness and integrate it right into the 2GR harness. And the other things you see in here that aren't in the standalone is the reverse lights, the speedometer, and the extra coolant temperature sensor for the gauge cluster. Those are MR2 specific, so they show up in the MR2 specific diagram. So there's nothing left to do at this point, but to actually wire it. So let's get to the range. And now I have that diagram printed in front of me. That way I can mark things off on it. And something to note, you can see there's a dotted line up here and a dotted line down here. The outside of this line is the MR2, and then inside is the 2GR, and also there's this section over here. This is the stuff. It's going on the 2GR harness because that's the way the MR2 wants it. It really has nothing to do with the 2GR. We're going to start by stripping down the stock harness, paying attention to these things. We're going to pull them out and make sure that we've got all of these appropriate terminal places. Now, something to keep in mind, if you remember, E6 on the diagram is this right here. Obviously, we're not going to have that, but on the site, you can buy this. It's just a connector here. It's not ideal. It doesn't go straight to wires. The connector going straight to wires doesn't actually exist. So you can just trim off the unneeded part and straighten these out, solder some wires to it. We'll cover that in a bit. So now let's label the connectors that we need to keep. Under the ECU, this is EA1, this is EA3, and this is EB1. And beyond that, we're going to need the reverse connector, and we're going to need the starter things. So both of these, and of course, we need the starter relay also. And then finally, we need to find the speed sensor, which is actually right here. We also need the engine lid switch, which I'm actually not finding on this harness. This car's been heavily modified before I bought it, so I think at some point it got stripped out. Either way, if you don't have this, the security system in the car will no longer trip if somebody opens the engine lid. But every other car opening will be just fine, so you can omit that. And it looks like the previous owner is forcing my hand on that. Though I think the connector may just be a spade like this. It's just that this isn't at the right spot for it, so maybe I'll salvage it later. I'm going to go check in the car in a bit to see if the engine lid switch sensor is even there. At this point, just take your time, and we're going to extract basically everything that'll allow us to get those connectors out with as much wire as possible. And in some cases, like the starter wire, we should actually be able to preserve all the wiring. Let's just start stripping this down. And in some instances, you could save a little bit of time by not stripping this back, because we know we're going to need everything on this branch. But personally, this wiring harness is 30 years old, and especially in this case where the previous owner has actually modified some things on it, like there's some really classy rework like this stuff. I just want to inspect the whole harness anyway, so I'm even on the wires that I know I don't need to pull that off of, I'm pulling it all off. Now we do need to keep the grommet, but unfortunately because of how many wires we have to pass through it, we can't keep it intact. So we might as well slice it now. Just try to get a clean slice. And there it is. Just set that aside. And now to continue further, what we're going to do is we're going to start depinning all the locations that we're not using. We're going to take them off. That way we can keep sloughing off this part of the harness that we don't need. Alright, let's do EA3 next. We're actually not removing anything from EB1, so let's just fish them out of here. Cut as much wire off as we can. And some of these we're not even going to end up using the wire because we're going to go right into the other one, but alright, I think we've got everything we need. Obviously, don't throw this out until you've actually gotten your car running. And something else I wanted to talk about. The diagnostic port, technically you should probably leave it on the car, but the thing is, this is going to require Toyota-specific tools, and you won't even be able to find those tools at the dealer anymore. You know, without this port, you won't be able to talk to your ABS module or your airbag module, but frankly, good luck even with that port. So we're not going to bother keeping it. So essentially, what we're saving is this. We've got this to go into the fuse box, this for the firewall, which we unfortunately have to cut. It's unfortunate. And then we got the speed sensor, the EA1, EA3 starter relay, the starter solenoid the power for the starter relay and the starter solenoid wire, the reverse lights, and EB1, which is the main power connector, coolant temperature sender. Which, actually, there's multiple options on this, so we're going to cover that when we get further along. You can keep that, or you can go to the 3-pin sensor. For this harness, we're actually going to be doing the 3-pin sensor, so we'll end up cutting that off. All right, I'm going to take a second to clean this up, and we're going to bring the RAV4 harness up here. And there you go. We're all clean now, and now we've got our RAV4 harness, which thankfully isn't nearly as dirty. On this harness, we've got a bit of the same thing going on. There's a lot of this stuff we don't care about, so we're just not going to unloom. You've got the ECU connector, you've got the fuse box connections. You're going to follow that through, and then there's the transmission leg / starter and all that stuff. So basically, on this side of it, we're going to strip the wire loom, and on that side, we're just not going to touch it. The other thing to note is for it to be able to fit through the hole, this back shell here is going to have to come off. So let's get to it. Also, at this point, we're not going to disconnect any wires on this harness. We're going to wait until it's all stripped. Now, at this point, we can see what we're working on. There's definitely some things we can clean up a lot of. Like you can see, these are transmission connectors, so most of this we don't care about. And in fact, there's this one wire that goes into the rest of the harness. And if you look at it, that goes to pin number 2 here. This is actually our source of ignition. This is what we're going to use to shove the transmission permanently into drive according to this. All these other wires should go straight to this connector because the ECU also controls the transmission. We're going to clip all those out of there in a minute. And then there's also this. This is the current sense for the battery. That goes all to the ECU connector. That's all going to get cut off and capped. This is the mass airflow sensor, so we're keeping that one. This is going to need removed also, but I'll tell you what, I'm actually going to get rid of these transmission things here first. Go ahead and cut this. And the other wire we need is pin 7, which is this blue one right here. Tape these together here as a reminder, and we're going to mark this D for drive. There's the battery current sensor. I'm just going to cut them, and we're going to cap them off. I'll show you guys how to cap them off properly here in a bit. Gone. So what, we're just going to cut these and fish them through. This one goes in chassis integration. We'll deal with that in a minute. So that was the range sensor. This is all the solenoids for the transmission. You can do the exact same thing here. Get rid of that. I'll go to the ECU. We're just going to trim these. And I'm leaving these a little bit long because we're going to stagger terminations in a bit, and that'll allow them to lay nicer in the harness. These are speed sensors on the transmission, so we're going to get rid of them. And then this, we can also get rid of. This is a solenoid on the airbox that makes it so that the engine draws air from under the hood or through the fender. We don't have that functionality. We're removing it. This is actually an ignition line, so we're going to mark it as such. It's probably going to come in handy later. So we're going to disassemble this and start cleaning this up. And now, some of these wires earlier that we disconnected from the transmission stuff, we're just going to de-pin them. And then remember, we're using the starter stuff from the MR2, so the starter wire we can remove. Now we've got this relatively cleaned up. On these small wires that you're not going to be using, what I suggest you do, take a small piece of heat shrink tubing, fold this over like that, slip that on, and heat shrink it. Now me, personally, these are already bugging me. I was actually planning on doing this just because this is the way you guys are probably going to be doing it, but it's bugging me, so I'm going to remove these. Now keep in mind, when you remove them, you will no longer have a plug in these ports, so the ECU needs to be mounted inside. It can no longer be mounted in the engine bay. You could fill the holes with RTV. Alright, much cleaner. And finally, while we're here, you can see pins 31 and 32 need to come out of this connector. You can see this wiring diagram just has this big, large drawing here going to the motor. That's really what that's expressing, is this whole bundle. So out of that bundle, you're going to pull those two wires. 32 just gets cut, and 31 gets rerouted here to EA3 pin 17. The reason for that is because we're switching from a computer-controlled alternator to an internally regulated alternator. I can't explain why, but some people have had issues getting the computer-controlled alternator working, and since I don't know what the reason is, and this alternator is easier to find anyways, the internally regulated one is just going to be the one we're going to wire for. Pins 31 and 32. And this yellow and pink right here. And the pink wire we get rid of. It actually goes all the way over here in the alternator connector. Just to avoid any stray signals from there, we're also going to cut it right at the alternator. You could pull it out of the harness, but here's the thing. To pull this wire from here to there, you got to disassemble the whole harness. You're more than welcome to do that if that's something that interests you. For me, I'm just going to trim it. See, by cutting it right here and fishing it out, it's never going to make a short on anything. Now we still have this yellow wire. Pull that out. That's actually going to end up going in this bundle. We're going to mark it with the position that it needs to go to. So that's going to be EA3 17. Now this pin, unfortunately, will not match where it's going, so it will need a crimp. We'll get there in a bit. It's the voltage sense for the alternator. And at this point, we're done with this. So let's close it back up so that none of the wires fall out, because you're in a world of pain if that happens. Okay, and then the lock on the side here. There you go. So let's mark these off as done. So at this point, we've got one wire labeled to where it needs to go. Let's depin these and label them as to where they need to go. So this is going to be mostly this part of the diagram up here. So let's see, we're going to start with this. This is BA4. Let's see, this is a BA4. So we're going to pull pin 7 out of here. And by the way, this symbol here just means that the wires get connected together. So right now, the only thing we're worried about is that it goes to EB1 pin 2. So let's mark it. Next, let's do BA3. Okay, so we need pins 3 and 8. They both go to the same place, so we can pull them out at the same time and mark them together. This is the wideband O2 sensors. And next, let's tackle BA1. Make sure the lock is open. So this one here goes to EA3 pin 4. So first, BA1 pin 1 is EA3 pin 4. BA1 pin 3 is EA3 pin 16. BA1 pin 5 is going to go to EB1 pin 2. And BA1 pin 9. And the reason this goes to two locations, this is actually the oil pressure switch, and EA3 pin 7 is the gauge cluster so that the light works on the cluster, but E6 pin 7 is the power steering pump control. Conveniently, the output from the oil pressure switch is exactly what we need for the power steering pump, so now the power steering pump will be off whenever the engine is off, or if you have a catastrophic oil failure, but at that point I'm not really worried about your power steering. BA1 pin 10 is going to go to EB1 pin 5. And BA1 pin 7 goes EB1 pin 4. BA1 pin 6. This one's a ground and ends up going to quite a few locations. As you can see here, it goes to EA311, EA33, and then the signal ground as well as the chassis ground for the diagnostic port. I'm just going to mark it ground. Now, we've got some more cleaning to do. You could just cut all of these and cap them, but some of them we can actually remove some of this. If you're curious what they do, the spreadsheet that was attached in the description actually gives a description for all of it. So let's figure this out and clean them up. And then what we've got left is 13 wires that are all labeled that need to go right into the MR2 harness. And these 2 wires that need to get connected together. These spare wires that go there. And that's it. At this point, we've gone as far as we can go with just the 2GR harness. It's time to start integrating. And if you remember what I said, the reason we're using the RAV4 harness, it's because these terminals actually fit right in the connector housings for the MR2. So let's get the MR2 harness back up here. So now we're just going to start marking things off of this diagram that we've already done. Now, some of these things are already done for us. Like, if, for example, this backup switch and the speed sensor going to EB1 pin 7. So this is the power right here, this black with yellow. And you can see it's already going to EB1 pin 7. And it's going to power the speed and the reverse lights. So the only thing here is there's a spare source of ignition here. So for now, just in case you forgot something as we're going through this diagram, instead of cutting it off, I'm just going to write ignition on here. and it might come in handy later. As well as where it goes, because when we're looking at this later, it might be a little harder to see. And that crosses this out and this out. Now, since we're in this area, we might as well continue checking things. So, those are the reverse lights. The other end of that is supposed to end up at EA3 pin 13, which it should, since this came out of the car. But here we go. Here's EA3. And over here, which is pin 13. We're good here. And then the speedometer. Oops. They need to go to EA1. So they're already going to EA1. And pin 1 and 10. Now, I can see they go to 1 and 10. For the sake of this, sure, let's go ahead and check. So the one that goes on number 1, which is the one right up here, the brown one, is the one that goes on pin 2. So brown one should be in the middle. And as you can see there, brown is in the middle. So there you go. So, got part of the diagram already. Now, this is supposed to be our engine lid switch. And I confirmed in the car, the previous owner actually removed the switch from there. So you would want to put the switch connector right here. In my case, I'm going to be removing it since I have no switch. And mark it off. Let's get this starter stuff taken care of. This black and white wire here going right to the relay. We don't have to check the pin out on that. We know that's going to the right place. So that's good. That's good. And now we've got the red wire here, which we can see is terminated. It goes to EA3 pin number 8, which is this one right here. This one goes to a split. Now, we don't have it going to a split anymore. This just has power for multiple things. We're going to cut that off. Now, because this needs an extension, and right now we don't have any spacing on this, we're actually just going to leave that disconnected. So we're going to want to come back to that. These ones that we have to add wires in, we're going to wait till we get the shape of the harness. So now, take these other ones here, and now let's start putting them at the right place. EA3 pin 4 is that one right here. So since we have a pin that's going to fit in there, there's no need to have this. So let's take this out and put that in. The harnesses are officially attached together. EA3 pin 16 is right here. Same deal, we're not going to need this, so we'll just take it out and put the right pin in there. The next one, EB1 pin 4, has a large terminal and actually goes to a large terminal slot. All right, now that's the end of the things that connect directly. So let's take this harness, go to the car, figure out all our branch length with some zip ties, and then we can start adding wires where necessary. All right, now we just place this where everything needs to go. Oh, no wonder I was having problems getting it fit. See this? This is the crank position sensor. This is the front bank cable. As you can see, we've actually got quite a bit of extra length here. And just kind of take your time on this. Organize everything where it needs to go. So we're actually going to have to straighten that out. And when you do something like that, make sure you don't see any fracture lines here. Sometimes these can get a little bit brittle. If you do, it's best to change the end. Now let's get some tape and organize this. Now the key here is we're trying to form a backbone for our harness, so we don't want to trap any wires in here that aren't actually terminated yet. All right, let's pull it out. And it's important to make this fit through here. You actually have the handle open and just kind of fish it through. And be careful, that handle is not the strongest thing, so just be gentle with it. So now you can see the general structure. Now there's some more cleaning up to do, of course, but got the ECU plug right on that same branch. You've got the plug that goes underneath the ECU and the starter relay. And then we get into the engine bay. First thing that it escapes is the starter power and starter solenoid. Then right off the top right there also is going to be the mass airflow sensor. And then this is just a bundle of unconnected wires still. It looks like I accidentally got a couple trapped in here, but then it looks like what's going to make sense is to have this power cable escape right where it conveniently can. So you can see there's some wires that go that way, so it'll be about right here. And then from there, because this goes down, because it's a little too long, but wrapping this on top of itself to shorten it is just going to be a real pain, and it's not worth it. So a little bit down from there, since it's going down, it's going to be the speed sensor. Escaping the harness at the same spot is also going to be the reverse sensor. And then this is going to continue on to the fuse box connectors. So looks like I got a couple wires that are like this red one here kind of got trapped in there. And so let me just kind of address that. Now I'm happy with where we are. So this right here is a bundle we still have to hook up. Mass airflow sensor, starter. This is a ground that goes to, see this pack right here, it's splitting up grounds. And it's going to end up going at a couple spots. And the ECU, starter relay, connector under the ECU. And then of course we've got all these wires up here that need to be connected. So, and now we know whenever we make something, it needs to follow along these branch lines. So we know all the wire lengths. Well, let me grab the equipment we're going to need for the next steps, and I'll be right back. All right, for the next step, we're going to crimp some wires. We're not actually going to solder anything. The two butt crimps that I'm going to use a lot of are going to be these from Waytech, 22 to 18 gauge and 16 to 14 gauge. I've also got a few other sizes. It's just a cheap kit. It's not from Waytech in case we need them. I don't usually need them for something like this. Then a box full of heat shrink gun, miscellaneous wire strippers, and ratcheting crimpers. I really like these ratcheting crimpers. They tend to do a better job because they tend to be more consistent every time. On that heat shrink, I know this won't surprise you guys. I buy it a large spool at a time. Honestly, this stuff gets really cheap in large quantity. And you can see by the dust in here, it's not like I use this very often. Critical thing you want is, you see how it says dual wall adhesive? That means that there's glue inside, and when you shrink the joint, the glue will fill that air space and prevent any water or oxygen from getting to the joint. It'll last a lot longer that way. So let's just keep marking things off on here. Let's do this guy right here. This giant ground distribution. We're going to take this one here. We're actually going to just tie it right into this ground. There's this. Right here. It's grounds, then EA311 and EA33. So I don't have the OBD2 port just yet. I'll find it in a bit. But we do know it's going to be near where the ECU is, so we're going to do that. All right, so now we've got 5 wires to connect. Always put your heat shrink on as soon as you can so you don't forget it. And then if you want to test if your crimps are correct, you should use some test pieces of wire. A proper crimp will never pull out. Once you pull hard enough, it'll break the wire. Put the heat shrink on it and shrink it. All right. And then go back to this drawing and cross them off. We're going to leave these two open for later. Oxygen sensor power. Both go to EB1 pin 6. Done. EB1 pin 5. So that's the ignition coil power. Oh, that's right. This one needed a large terminal, not a small terminal. EA3-17. And mark it off. EB1 pin 2. There's going to be 2 wires that say EB1 pin 2. There you go. EA37 and E67, which actually brings us to another point in our conversation. If you look at this diagram, you'll see this here. Most of this is all this connector here, which is the chassis side connection for the stock ECU. And most of it understandably goes to right here, which is the E6 connector. And it makes sense because that's chassis integration and this is chassis integration. So the same kinds of wires are going to need to go on both of them. Now, there's no mating connector available for this that goes straight to wires. But I do have this thing available. It's for sale on the site. The link's in the description. And you can follow the diagram by just cutting this thing off right here and only using the E6 portion and then soldering some wires on the back of this. I'm really not a huge fan of soldered wires on something like this going and then the stress of the harness, shaking it and potentially cracking it. So I don't want to do that. But here's the thing. On this guy, E6 is this one here, which has not as many connections as this one. So instead, we're going to plug the unmodified vehicle harness in here, and then I'm going to solder some wires from here to here, and we're going to come out here, because if we look at our harness, we've already got the connectors for that, and we're going to be throwing these out anyways, so why not use them? So that's how I'm going to go about it. Here's a quick picture of the diagram that I'm going to use. And if you notice on that, since we've got an extra connector on here, I'm just going to use it for all the drive-by-wire stuff. Why not? It just makes things easier. And if you notice, something else I did while I was in there, see this junction right here? Well, E6-1 right here comes in, and it's got 3 outputs. So it's got 1, 2, 3 output. Get to save some crimps in the harness. We're going to rename all the E6 pins to be the new pin numbers. Sorry, just ended up doing a bunch of work with the camera at the wrong zoom level. All I did is I put the numbers, the new numbers, just by following the traces here to what they connect to. There's an exception here because 1 goes to 11, 12, and 13. So 11, 12, and 13. Renamed this one and also this one. So this one, this connector is going to be a little bit past this one. We're going to place it about here. Anything needs to go from here. We'll need to follow this route all the way to there. EA3, pin 7. This is the one that's controlling the power. It's the oil pressure, but it's controlling the power steering also. All right, we go back to marking things off. EA3, pin 8. This coolant temperature thing just needs to go to the right place. There's the coolant temperature. There's this wire here, EA3, pin 6. That's actually going to just reach. Great. Next, that guy. And in this kit, there's these 2 wires they're small wires, but they've got the large connection. That's actually for when you're using the 2AR. It's for the fans, and you don't want to use these for high current. So we're just going to set them out of the way since the 2GR can't control its own fans, and we don't accidentally use these. Other than that, all of these wires are the same gauge, and all of these ones are a bigger gauge. You can use them at your discretion. By the way, if you're mounting it in the engine bay, these are seals for the leftover open slots. We're not going to bother with these since the other connector has like 30-something open holes now. So we'll just get that out of the way. And by the way, quick tip. When you're trying to figure out these connectors, which pin is which, you can see right here, see it says the number 11 right there. And it'll say, they're not all going to be marked, but there's going to be a bunch more that are marked. You know, like 60 is marked. Number 4 is marked up here. 53 is marked here. You know, there's enough of them that are numbered. Okay, and even 1 is numbered right here. There's enough of them that are numbered on here that you can tell which order it is. So you can tell if this diagram is like this, which it is, or if it's like this, right? Because this would put you the pins in all the wrong direction. So, just a quick tip. Now what we've got left to do is the tachometer and the cruise control. Now on this tachometer, this signal converter, I'm going to hook it straight up because I'm going to change the tachometer board, and I'll show you guys how to do that, but most people just opt to put a signal converter in the line, and here's an example of one. Next we need the tachometer signal, and you need to put an adapter in the line because it's expecting a high voltage 4-cylinder signal, and what we've got is a low voltage 6-cylinder signal. To power it, there was an extra ignition wire in this bundle right here, is the black wire. It'd be a great use to power that. And this is usually the one that I recommend. It's just a tachometer adapter, something like this, but there's really nothing special. As long as it can go from a 6-cylinder low voltage to a 4-cylinder high voltage, you're good to go. Personally, I'm going to go for the alternative, which is replacing the tachometer board inside the gauge cluster. I will show you guys how to do that when we get there. So because I'm doing that, I'm just going to go straight through without an adapter. So we're back EA3. That's this guy right here. Pin 5. It's going to go all the way over here. that wire has to travel some distance. All right, and that goes to pin 15. And then another one that goes all the way is this cruise control. So that also starts at EA3 and 18, which is this one right here. And in fact, this is a heavy gauge wire here because it was used for something different from the factory. And I don't want to use that. I'm actually going to switch it out for this smaller gauge one. Not necessary. It's just going to, I don't like changing wire gauges in the middle of the harness unless I have to. All right, and that goes to pin 40. The ignition switch right here. EB1, pin 1. All right, home stretch. OBD2 port. Got one right here. Can high, pin 6. Goes to 41. 41 is right over here. And can low goes to 49, which is right here. Okay, that's hooked up. All right, pin 11 over here, which is this one right here, needs to go over here. So let's get an extension. There's that one. And then over here, I've got a wire labeled OBD ground, which is definitely going to need an extension. And it needs hooked up to this last wire. All right, we'll cross that off. All right, so it's a big milestone now. Everything on here is crossed off. All we've got left to do is tape this up, loom it up and everything. And see, this is what I meant with, we can hide crimes in there. That wire for some reason ended up a whole lot longer than the others. Not really a big deal. Folded up on top of itself. And if you have a lot of wires like that, just stagger the folds. That way the harness doesn't get unruly. Oh, we almost forgot that one. Sets the ECU permanently into drive. All right. Now, before covering it in wire loom, we're going to go test fit it on the car. We don't need to fully install the harness right now. We just need to lock the position in. Now we just need to add wire loom. So I'm going to add the loom for this inside the car, since that's it really can't be added elsewhere. And clip it in. And because we can't get the tape around there, we're going to get a zip tie. Actually, 2 zip ties. And then we'll take it out and tape it up. Now we take the zip tie off at the top, replace that with tape. Okay, and test fit again. That goes in, that goes in, that goes in, and then let's screw it down just to make sure. And check that the fuse fits. There we go. Beautiful. All right, now we just need to wire loom this up, and you'll see it'll look beautiful in a minute. All right, and we should be ready for the final install in the engine bay at this point. Let's go do that. All right, I'll skip you guys yet another time lapse. Engine harness is installed. One last thing left to discuss on the harness is the coolant temperature sensor. So this is the old style coolant neck that I make. The new one has an outlet right here. This is the wire that we added in for the temperature gauge on the gauge cluster, and this is the one for the ECU. Now, on this old style, this plugs in right up here with the 3S GTE sensor, and the stock one goes down here, right in the stock location. The new style that I make, this goes forward here, and right about here plugs into, again, the 3S GTE sensor. Or if you're using Alex's solution, there's this, which is the 3-pin sensor from the Toyota Echo. Actually, this ends up on a bunch of Chevy applications also. This goes right into the stock location. Now, this isn't the water neck that I'm going to be finally using, so you should have a crush washer in between there. And then the other thing you need is this pigtail. Now, this pigtail needs these 3 wires. The one on the bottom is what goes to the gauge cluster, and the other 2 is what goes here. Pins 1 and 2 here match 1 and 2 there, though this is just a resistive element, and I don't actually think it matters if you flip them, but try to get them right. So let's just splice that in real quick. And there you go. Coolant temperature sensor. And now we have just a few finishing touches. We'll go back to this diagram, and if you notice on the side here, I identified some colors with some pin numbers. That's for this harness. So it goes from that middle ECU connector to the drive-by-wire pedal. That's very straightforward. We're not going to go through that on video and add yet another 10 minutes to this video. And then the other thing is this actual pin out here. What I did is I wired it on the back of this thing. I covered it in epoxy, just gave it a layer of paint because it was an ugly yellow. And that plugs right into our ECU. And that works everything work together by plugging in our drive-by-wire, as well as our chassis connector for the MR2. And then the pigtail that came off the harness that we just added in there. And there we go. And there you go. At this point, this thing's electrically ready to run. Hopefully that made this chart here make a whole lot more sense, and you're willing to tackle the electrical yourself. I know this was a really long video, and I hope most of you noticed that none of these steps were actually difficult. You just had to keep track of things along the way, make sure you write things down, take your time, and do it right. For frame of reference, normally this takes me 6 to 10 hours or so to do. With this video, I've got 18 hours of footage now, but shooting a video always makes things take a lot longer. Now, unfortunately, right now, I can't flick the key and start the car to show you guys that it works. There's a fair bit of plumbing that's left to do, so we're going to cover that in the next episode. The next video should be relatively short with the coolant, fuel, and evap plumbing, and also that first start. But if you don't mind, I need a bit of a distraction, and this is actually going to be the next video that's going to be posted. So what you're seeing here is a viewer submitted a 2GRFE head that I think was money shifted. One of the rockers got spit out. So I sliced it on the bandsaw, and I'm going to be taking this over to the mill, and I'm going to be cutting some slices out of it, and we're going to be doing some analysis on the different wall thicknesses for the sake of porting and making this thing flow better. So have a great day. I'll see you guys soon in the next video.